I wanted to talk to you all about. Glenn, many thanks to Glenn who helped me schedule and reschedule and put all this together, set up the room. Glenn and Louis yeah, for helping. So shout out to Glenn. Glenn says, you're welcome for the food and take it with you, or else he's gonna throw it away. Did I get that?
Yes.
Okay.
Take it all with you.
Good. So I do more of like academic talk, but I do more of the talk part. If you haven't had it online, I understand. But I did it next 2 weeks ago. Saw it. I think you get ready for that. I might put it. Title.
Yeah, it's by streaming.
Yes, great question. This is Kanisha Grant, our associate chair of our department. Thank you, Kanisha. Thank you so much. Thanks for staying, for being such a great leader. Gary Clark, who helped me get in the door. Thank you. Appreciate you. Teacher Middleton, really good teacher. Thank you, big deal. Thank you, Martin, welcome here. It's actually been very good. I don't know if you guys screaming in from Georgetown, but I've been perfect. But anyway, so here we are. They're not watching. Don't worry, they won't. But okay, so like I said, I do more talk than academic sometimes, and particularly in these contexts, because like if you want the academic, you can read the book. But I wanted to talk to you about what the project was about, what my motivations were, what impact I want to bring to the conversation, and which conversations I want to be a part of. And I think everybody in this room kind of already knows that, so this should be easy. Hey, Carlos, my wonderful TA, helped me answer emails I've missed. What's up? All right. So, and the head coach, Mary Tessa Michael, welcome. We are married. Look at her. So, I'm just going to get to it then. If you have any questions or anything in the middle, you can just ask. So the book, Invisible Weapons, Infiltrating Resistance and Defeating Movement. So the book is about conversations I was having with people in my life, which is pretty much people on the left. I don't really know any, I know conservatives, but I don't know any like Republicans or like kind of right-wing folks. I just know people on the left. Some are more engaged, some are less. I was just trying to figure out why. That really was the motivation. And one of the things I noticed in the midst of the movement was a lot of people were activated, were engaged in ways that I had never seen them turn up before. They really kind of tapped in. It was something that was beautiful, right? One of the things I'll say at the end, right, is that even now, we've gotten to a place where we'll say hashtag Black Lives Matter, right? But we don't actually like remember what happened, right? If you say it a little slow, right? Black lives matter, right? And I get the feeling every time I do that. That's why I like doing it. I'm just kind of reminded of that feeling that we got when this thing was happening, right? We were more bold. We were talking more shit at our jobs. We were engaged openly in action and protest, right? We were doing things that I think a lot of us weren't doing, you know, the 5 or 10 or 15 years before that. And in the midst of that, I also recognize, as somebody who was doing some organizing work in Chicago and a lot of just protesting and just community work when I was there, that somehow we were still doing different things. That there was a disconnect between the organizers I knew and grassroots communities. A lot of people showed up, but their politics weren't changing, right? The people were still misogynists. People were still interested in hierarchy. People were still, you know, homophobic and just causing all these problems. But they were saying, but I support the movement. I'm like, don't you know the movement is about this thing? So that was kind of the motivation when I made the book. There were some key questions that I was getting at. First of all, why were so many of my people on the left really rooted and invested in liberalism? So much so that they would outwardly reject any type of radical or revolutionary politics, right? We would talk about it. I'm not gonna call y'all out because I remember all of our conversations. But some of the folks in the room, right, we would talk about abolition. They'd be like, I don't believe in abolition. I just think that we need to fundamentally change everything that we know and do about police. I was like, yeah, that's what abolition is. Like, oh, okay, well maybe I'm doing it, right? And so it was those types of conversations that had me wondering why we had this kind of knee-jerk response to, can you all see the well-crafted PowerPoint that I put together? Still never serious. So to be specific, right? We've heard this, many of us have heard this before. Angela Davis talked about it, Polly Murray, the Howard Law grad, talked about it, Barbara Ransby talks about it. But the idea of radicalism generally just means getting to the root of a thing, right? There's something somewhat intellectual about it, right? There's a studying there, the idea that you're actually invested in making something happen. Not that you just say, well, yeah, of course, I'm not going to be, intentionally discriminatory, but that you're actually like, okay, how can I do better? Easiest example I have is abolitionists. They will talk a lot about getting the cop out of their head. I don't know any abolitionist that hasn't said that, not one. Right? They all say I had to get the cop out of my head first. I'm still getting that cop out of my head because I cycle back to that way of thinking so often. And that's what radicalism is saying. It's just getting to the root of the thing. Radical politics, right, is a proper noun. Very often, radicalism can get used interchangeably with extremism, and sometimes for good reasons. You can be a radical extremist, sure. But when I talk about radical politics, it's really getting into the question of which roots you're getting at. So as you can see here, the movement for Black Lives is deeply, explicitly, consistently still rooted in a Black queer feminist politics. That's race, that's gender, that's sexuality. Right? They really wanted us to understand how vulnerable communities are created through oppressions and how we can maybe move past that, how we can overcome that, how we can dismantle those systems. All right? So I want to narrow in on a very particular point, and the best way to articulate that is through the Say Her Name movement. So Say Her Name, it was started in 2015. It's a campaign, a series of campaigns started by the African American Policy Forum. It's Kimberly Crenshaw's organization. There's a lot of misgivings or misunderstandings about Say Her Name, let alone feminism in general. But they're not trying to take away from in any way, take away from our deep kind of visceral responses to Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown Jr. or Eric Garner, right? But they want us to also recognize when we don't have those reactions to the Erica Garners, right? Michael Garner's daughter, who died a few years later after having 2 heart attacks, right? We want to hold her up. She had a heart attack after having her first child that she named after her father, right? Was very active and very involved in the movement, but very few people were saying her name. We all were around, right, when we were uplifting Breonna Taylor alongside George Floyd, knowing that this is very important to make sure that all Black lives are mattering. And that is a challenge in any number of ways. That doesn't change a lot of the other conversations, but it just allows us to focus a little differently on what type of politics we're engaging in. So all this is to say that the movement was asking very similar questions that I'm asking in this book about why people are choosing not to engage in certain cases. And my answer is that oppressed racial and gender groups are being targeted and coerced away from their politics. So this isn't some blame the victim nonsense, some of which we're seeing now in response to Takeoff, the rapper being killed in Houston. It's not one of those things. I want to understand how the system facilitates these behaviors. And so my data, it shows that people, again, are being targeted, particularly marginalized racial and gender groups, being targeted and coerced away from radical politics. In fact, my data shows that people's political co-optation, it's a part of a process. The politics are first silenced, then they get disempowered, and then eventually they simply align themselves with the status quo. Right? This is the result of the data that I collected in this project, and the value of this work. It helps us explain how someone, maybe not exactly Kanye, who, poor thing, but how someone like that, how someone goes from a place where they're saying George Bush doesn't care about Black people. That was a moment. That was relevant, deeply. How does he get from there to wherever he's at right now, right? And there are a lot of other explanations, right? We can have the mental health conversation. We can have the capitalism conversation. We can have the conversation about how he's trying to break into institutions that somehow weren't letting him in, but we're letting him get through. Right? We can have those conversations, but the conversation I want to have is the one that wraps around movements. Right? I don't particularly care about these key figures. I care about grassroots communities. So my work is more of a bottom-up approach. And so I want to talk about how the people who support this guy, who find themselves in him, who see their politics articulated through a Kanye West, how did they end up in that place? Maybe they're just conservatives, right? And that's something that we just have to accept. Many Black people in particular just are. But from a movement standpoint, I see this pattern, right? I see how HIV and AIDS movement in Black communities was dismantled. I see how the women's anti-violence movement was taken apart, right? And I want to see, well, at the time, I wanted to see how it was happening in the movement for Black lives. So let's get into that. Good time for questions. Any questions so far? Abba. Yes. And I'm going to talk about it not from, so I'm going to get into that in the literature part. This is kind of the roadmap. Literature, methods, theory, findings. It's pretty straightforward. And in the literature part, this book, these two books, this one here, and actually this one right here, the advantage of this one right here. So Regina Gauss wrote a book about the movement and how elected officials respond to it, right? So it's still movement oriented, but it's focusing on elected elites. This book, Stephen Woodley's Reckoning, is about the movement and focus on movement elites, right? The people, the organizers that I talked to in the book, right? And they're just having somewhat different conversations. The conversation I'm having is how the movement is basically undermined by kind of pulling the rug out from under them, the rug being grassroots communities that uphold and what that process looks like. So these other two books, Steadfast Democrats and The Anger Gap, they have some explanations. So Steadfast Democrats talks about social pressures, right? The idea that if you go to vote in the upcoming election, the midterm election, which you should, and you are registered as an independent, right? And you run in and you're Black and you run into a Black person, that Black person, according to their theory, is going to pressure you and be like, why are you doing that? You need to do better. You need to actually align with the Democrats and you need to be more responsible. Take yourself seriously. Goddamn, right? They might cut you out. And that's a part of this, right? Why are people so tied into that? Because there is some social pressure. Gavin Phoenix's book, The Anger Gap, he talks about anger in politics. And this is starting to get at what I'm doing. He talks about how Black people are convinced that they are not allowed to express their anger in the political sphere. Very important research there. It's the idea that we are pushing things into or out of politics, which, as Andre can tell you, we are literally talking about in my class this semester. Right? How are we convinced that certain things belong in politics and certain things don't, when the reality is we understand oppression and we know that marginalization and oppression is a way of saying you don't belong in politics, right? So my book is doing something a little bit different than these texts. I'm asking why grassroots communities are cooperating with neoliberal politics that compound our oppression. Why are we cooperating with these people? And again, it's not the blame the victim thing. I know that we have power. I know that the promises of democracy that Stephen Woodley's work talks about are in us. I know that we drive democracy. That's what her book talks about. But you know, the skeptic in you might say, and also Marcus, we are doing this work, right? Maybe we're just doing it smartly, which 100%, right? When we talk about how did Biden win South Carolina, we are extremely smart. We are pragmatic. We are selective and wise about how we use our votes, for example. And at the same time, I also said it's the biggest movement ever, right? So skepticism is fair, right? What are you talking about if you say we're not doing these things, right? And yet all of this is happening? And to that, I would say, I'm not a journalist, right? I'm not interested in the headline. I actually need substance. I need to know what people's politics are. So just because I show up to a protest doesn't mean that I'm invested in what this protest is about. Maybe I just want to turn up, right? Maybe I just had time on my hands. Maybe I think that this is a social event where I can meet new people. Right? There are a lot of reasons people show up to protest. There's a story that I told a few weeks ago, again, where I was participating in a die-in at U Chicago when I was there. And a die-in, if you don't know, is where you essentially go and you block something. You lay down, and the idea is that you're symbolizing a dead body, that you're embracing that moment and recognizing and acknowledging that the same way that people are dying is not so far off in the world, but that it could be you, it could be me, right? And I truly, and I mean, like I told it before, but I'll say it again, it really was a surreal moment, because that notion of death, truly, as far back as I can remember, was deeply, it has penetrated my mind in ways that I can't even explain, right? And so it was just a powerful moment, right? But then I go to other protests, right? I hear these stories, and they have their funny signs, taking selfies, right? The Pepsi commercial, which was truly might be iconic, honestly, but also really problematic, right? It makes it clear that we're not all doing the same things while we're there. And just because we're saying that there are protests, and there is movement, and that is important, does not necessarily mean that everybody's engaged in radical politics. And that's the conversation that I'm having, right? What is it? What are these people doing? And why is it so different from the politics at the center of the movement? Those are the questions I'm asking. So method-wise, man, I do a lot in this book. If I'm being honest, I was like, look, you gonna get to write another book? I don't know. Let's just put it on this one. So if you've read it, parts of it are a little dense, but I just talk big shit. Sorry, Mom. I love you. My mom's on the Zoom. For real, sorry. So I do a lot of data collection. I have surveys, I have interviews, and content analysis. In this talk, I want to focus on the critical social theory, which is basically the invisible weapons framework. It's basically what the book is titled, but it's a framework that I put together to explain some of these things, how power gets recycled back up to people with that dominate us and oppress us. And I want to talk a little bit about case studies, particularly the Baltimore Uprising and Corinne Gaines, who was not somebody who people in mass responded to. Question? Okay. Good? Following? Going a little quick, I know. It's hot. I promised my homie I would wear this. And I did. It don't match. It's complicated. I love my people. If you know, you know. Shoot. All right. So invisible weapons. So invisible weapons, what is an invisible weapon? It's a political tool coercing marginalized groups away from advocating for their own needs. So we know about a lot of tools that coerce people, right? Militaries are a tool. Propaganda is a tool, right? We know in 2016, that was a tool to coerce people away from what they actually wanted. But invisible weapons are unique because they eliminate people's sense of choice. They don't believe that they can do a thing. They think, Patrick Markell says it's the loss of responsiveness to events and the erosion of contexts where action makes sense, right? It's teaching people that I actually can't do this thing, right? So for those who were with me in college or in that era, you know that I would say things to professors that should not be said to professors. It's just who I was, right? And maybe I still am. But I didn't have that thing that told me you can't talk to this person like that. I was like, I don't care. I don't know nothing about these people. They're talking to me reckless, and so I'm gonna say something back. Is that smart? No, don't do that. But there's this idea that we have a choice of how we participate in school, how we participate in class. We just talked about it in our class last week, right? How you sit down, how you face front, how you sit quietly, right? Teaching you to do what? Well, we can have that conversation. But the idea is that it's eliminating people's sense of choice and constraining their autonomy, particularly in political contexts. And also, these weapons are invisible. So they're not just when we see tanks in Ferguson, but it's what's behind the tanks, right? It's the broken windows police. And I think each citizen in Ferguson had 1.25 warrants or something like that, right? Because they were out there fining and taxing and doing all this stuff on people to create a context where it's not just the violence of a sundown town, but it's the threat of it. And that threat does significant work to people. Um, so in a lot of ways, it's just another implication of like insider-outsider dynamics. But this time it's not about your workplace or your neighborhood. And instead applies to your politics and ideology, how you get pushed out of your own politics. And so invisible weapons are coercing people to become anti-radical. And the framework is explaining how this process happens. So there are three parts to the framework. Two of them are in this figure. First is the neglect of structural accountability. So I say in the text, structural accountability generally is acknowledging the ongoing biases of US institutions, embracing institutional transformation, and providing reparations for damages. I'm gonna say that again. What would a structural accountability, embracing structural or making it essential, embracing it, look like? It would look like acknowledging the ongoing biases. Oppression is real. It would look like embracing institutional transformation. We know oppression is real. We know we've committed to it because we haven't worked against it, and now we're going to work against it. And it looks like providing reparations for prior damages. Not only are we going to fix it moving forward, we're going to try and do something about the stuff we did in the past. That's what structural accountability is. And I had to define it so specifically because we probably haven't ever seen it. Not in a lot of contexts. And this is coming from somebody whose job came from reparations, the first job, that is, because Georgetown owned and sold people that look like me. So I emphasize the neglect of structural accountability and acknowledging the failure to combat oppression deliberately and adequately is in and of itself a form of abuse, right? So neglect is a form of abuse that in the academic context is actually really hard to prove because you're trying to say somebody's doing nothing and that it actually has content, there's substance there. And that's really hard to prove in a lot of ways, which is why this is the theory part. And in practice, right, it does look like more police violence, but it also looks like more structures facilitating that violence, right? So we know about police officers having their own Bill of Rights. We know about them having qualified immunity. What you may not know is that police reporting shootings and murders that they commit is voluntary, right? So we have some 17,000 police municipalities and departments across the country, and they get to choose when they report this information to the FBI. They just get to decide, right? And so in a lot of ways, I want us to start to remember how an obstruction to data collection is an obstruction to accountability. We see that a lot with social media networks too, right? Where they just stop us, and that's gonna play a big role in the Korean gang story as well. And then elitist agenda setting. So agenda setting in general is about establishing parameters, determining what power some people have and what others lack. But elitist agenda setting, it's not really that agnostic. It's setting norms, standard, and social meaning that reinforce elitist hierarchies through the way we understand politics, power, and the world at large, right? And I'll give you a sad but true example of that in a second. And so agenda setting power is more equitable when agenda setting power is more equitable. When it's more equitable and structural accountability is embraced, I expect choice to be expanded. That's what this is, expanded choice, right? But when agenda setting power is elitist, structural accountability is neglected, that's when we find it constraining the choice. So, and that limits behaviors and agendas that are allowable even in the political sphere. It really sets the hard line on how close we can even get to actually establishing a democracy. So I didn't want to put Obama's picture on this, but these are all quotes from him. I didn't put it there because y'all be mad sometimes, I don't know. Me and Barry have a complicated relationship. I mostly just don't like him and he doesn't know I exist. But nevertheless, everything on the left is stuff that he said, right? In the book, I talk about the Baltimore uprising. And if you don't know, the uprising it lasted about 2 weeks. It ended with fire. And in the first week and a half, all but the last 3 days really, were protesters engaged in this kind of nonviolent approach, which is fine. Nonviolence is cool, it's cute. It's important. However, they were walking through Baltimore and the racism was just jumping out. Right? The day drinkers, the brunchers, people at the baseball game, They were getting shouted out, cussed out. People were trying to hit them with their cars, which obviously ended up happening and killing some people in a few places, actually, but also in Virginia. All this was happening while they just remained nonviolent. And then one day, the police, Baltimore police, saw something on, I want to say it was Facebook, which would tell you what was going on back then, that said, there's going to be a purge tomorrow in our high school, all right? And so they somehow managed to take that threat seriously, even though all the law enforcement agencies said that's ridiculous. And they canceled school. So they sent all the kids home from school. The kids who ride buses go to this bus depot near Douglas, near Mondawmin Mall, yeah, near Douglas. And so they had all these kids, and the buses all just came and started dropping them all off in the same place, right? Which could be its own problem in and of itself if you've worked with young people ever. So the buses just dropped them off, and then the service is canceled. We still to this day don't know who or why, who ordered that and why it happened. So the kids are there, and when they get there, who's meeting them? Police in riot gear, in helicopters, with news cameras. Now somehow, with all those people present, and those very, very trustworthy police, we don't know who threw first song. Somehow, who knew? But they say the kids did it. Right? They say the kids started throwing rocks at these police who were there to instigate them. And so then it kind of went from there. So what we saw in the uprising, we saw the fires, we saw the people, stomping out police cars. And then after those few weeks, your boy, Barack, decided to chime in. He said that these are criminals and thugs. Now, I'm not asking you to disagree with Barack. You might be like, yeah, they was acting up. Duh, that's stupid. You shouldn't do that. I'm not here to disagree with you necessarily. What I'll say though is that he has a history of making these sorts of anti-radical kind of destabilizing remarks, chastising remarks when it comes to grassroots communities, protesters, who he did not say use this type of language towards are the police, the ones who literally severely injured, leading to the death and murder of Freddie Gray. He didn't say anything about them. He didn't say anything about the schools that failed Freddie Gray and Corinne Gaines. He didn't say anything about the lead paint in the city that poisoned Freddie Gray and Corinne Gaines. He didn't say anything about the gentrification, right? Pushing people, displacing Corinne Gaines from the city that she grew up in. And Freddie Gray living in the Gilmore Homes projects, which now don't exist because they tore them down. Didn't say anything about the food deserts or the poverty. Didn't say anything about any of those things, all right? And so a lot of times people will try and justify these types of very consistent behaviors by saying that, well, it's strategic or it's important to have these narratives, and that's fine. This ain't about Barack. I mean, he's trash in this context, but it's about the ways that these narratives are used very successfully. This elitist agenda setting is used to kind of shove those same personal responsibility and bootstraps and anti-Black narratives down people's throat, and it works. Right, the uprising stops dead in its tracks right there because Barack said something, and that's the third component that it leads to, is the grassroots non-event. Right, he can do that all he wants. If resistance keeps going, it doesn't matter, right? But it's effective, right? It leads to these grassroots non-events. So a non-event, this is one of the more complicated things to explain in the book. What is a non-thing? It indicates that something political is happening in moments where people aren't explicitly advocating politics, right? So the idea is they've been called weapons of the weak. There's a couple of books that talk about it, but it's like, the example I used in my last talk was, y'all remember Kings of Comedy? It was a long time ago, right? And Bernie Mac was saying, when we break, right? You seen Johnny? You remember that joke? No, tough crowd. His point was that when we break, we're gonna take our time, right? But why are we breaking like this? Robin Kelly has work, James Scott has work that talks about, John Brim has work, and Scott Gates, that talks about how people at bad jobs don't work hard if they feel like saying, this job is some shit. Sorry, mom, sorry. My manager doesn't treat me right. I'm not going to work hard. most all of us, to my knowledge, have been to college, right? If you're in a class and the teacher's a jerk, then maybe you are going to push the limits. Maybe you're not going to go to office hours. Maybe you're not going to get that little extra, right? Um, and so that's why they call them the weapons of the weak. They're people from the bottom kind of pushing up. But non-events don't always kind of go in favor of the downtrodden, excuse me. And so in Silencing the Past, that's Michel Rolf-Trio's book about the Haitian Revolution. He talks about how even historians, not intending to be awful, through any number of processes, will engage in practices that completely erase and eliminate the impact of the Haitian Revolution on our entire lives. And not understanding Blackness, not understanding revolution, not understanding oppression. Right? And we see that in a lot of scholarships today too about the civil rights movement. So Jean Theo Harris's book, A More Beautiful and Terrible Struggle, talks about how the civil rights movement got, that one and A Radical King, talks about how Martin Luther King got turned into Santa Claus and the civil rights movement got turned into like a game of patty cake while Bull Connor, got frustrated. And it completely erases all of the wide range of politics that were involved, cross-cutting and engaged in that moment. Barbara Ransby's book on Ella Baker, who, most of us never learn about, talks about how movements completely erase and silence these people, right? So it's not always a good thing when this thing is happening. And these erasures, very often, like the Ella Baker point, are used to erase the contributions of marginalized groups and omit the abuses that they experience. So in the uprising, it was people aligning with Obama. So hordes of Black people showed up that next day, the morning after the fires, after being blamed on a global scale. And they came out and they said, this isn't us. This isn't the right way. We're better than this. School students, Baltimore school kids showed up and they said, we're not hoodlums and thugs, which was a moment. And in doing so, they pivoted their own public politics away from accountability and towards that elitist agenda setting. They moved towards the narrative that was asked of them. Now, what's important about grassroots non-events, if you think about it as a cycle, is that oppression is pushing people down, fine. And if you push back, you push back. But there's a way that grassroots non-events reinforce the power that is used against you. It reinforces these narratives and pushes your politics further away from these radical politics that I'm talking about. So the invisible weapons framework shows how disempowering nonviolent protesters and silencing radical protesters marked the end of the uprising. And the consequences, a lot like Ferguson, right? There's a federal investigation in Baltimore, cited systemic civil rights violations by the police. They were charged in Baltimore, none were convicted. But what I argue is that the end of the uprising helps explain why Corinne Gaines, who was killed in Baltimore about a year later, was met with a resounding silence. So let's get into her story and then we'll get to questions. What resistance to invisible weapons would have looked like to all the Black people that showed up the next day? Yeah. Yeah, we love our community, we love our neighborhood, we're here to support it. We're not here to tear down the work that everybody's been doing up to this point. We're actually here to reinforce that work. Simple, right? In terms of narrative, at least. That's something that's very easy. But what people did was say that, and this is kind of the bigger point, by deliberately excluding radical politics, you're actually reinforcing the problem. So it's not saying that everybody's a radical, right? That's not the case. What it's saying is that by saying we can't have a relationship because I be doing too much, essentially, and not acknowledging that we need multiple prongs to affect this thing, but that we all can align with each other to be able to push back against the state, that work matters. That's the short version. So this part is a content warning is appropriate, particularly with issues of miscarriage, and then generally the violent murder of a person. I can't actually probably don't. I can't overstate the number of reasons why Corinne Gaines' murder was so egregious. It's literally impossible. For starters, she was holding her child when she was killed, to the point where the bullets that killed her, the shotgun blast, hit the kid, went through her body and hit the child. And that's not my conjecture. This is literally in the coroner report. Was holding the whole time. It was a 6-hour standoff. So at some point, after 6 hours, there was a guy named Royce Ruby Jr. who said, "Oh, well, she slid behind a wall or something. She was a threat at that moment." Now, Royce, his department was funded to have body cams. They just unfortunately had not distributed them yet. But fortunately for us, Corinne Gaines was streaming the entire thing, live streaming it, until police went through what's called a police officer portal with Facebook and had her live stream cut off. They didn't have a warrant to enter her premises. Right? They had a warrant for her arrest, and then they went to the property manager, and the property manager went to her house and opened the door to her in there playing with her kids and her man. So, and then on top of that, what was the warrant about? So the warrant was about her driving without a license plate. And that turned into a physical altercation with police, where she eventually suffered a miscarriage as a result of that incident earlier in that year, 2016. All of these things came together in this one moment. And so it was that event, and I knew organizers who were protesting, who spoke with her mother, who were invoking her name. They went and protest the Fraternal Order of Police's like national conference or something. But it just didn't get the same kind of response from people. And I think the Invisible Weapons Framework actually gives us the tools we need to explain why, right? I think, and let me be more specific, I think it's easy and accurate to say people are misogynists. Misogynoir is real, 100%. Why people are resistant to doing better, I think, is a question that requires a little bit more nuance to answer. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here. So I'm going to identify 3 reasons why why I believe movement supporters chose to disqualify Gaines from the support that she showed the movement. First, she was armed, right? She was holding her child. She was also holding a shotgun. And for many people, that's a disqualifying thing. And I urge you to sit with that and think about why her having a licensed weapon in her home that somebody came into without a warrant is a problem for you. Second, as Say Her Name reiterates, Corinne Gaines is a woman with a gun, not a man, like Philando Castile in Minnesota, who wasn't holding his gun, to be fair. And to be clear, right, very few people are going to outwardly say that her being a woman is disqualifying, but the lack of response in so many of these cases is truly undeniable, right? So it's not necessarily like, oh, well, I think this deliberately. It happens. It's just a fact. The third thing is that she openly expressed and engaged in radical and revolutionary politics, including her resistance to the fundamental authority of police. So you'll see a lot of her online accounts are still up. You can Google a lot of the videos that she recorded, whether it was that day or in other altercations with police. But she's very clear that she does not recognize the authority of police, that she wants to live and be free. And you may hate those politics. You may say this is an absurd person, and that's fine. But then she was killed for it. And I think it requires us to, at the absolute least, second guess why we're engaging in those practices. So being a woman, wielding a weapon, holding radical politics, those ended up being a death sentence for her and almost for her 5-year-old son. Driving without a license plate forced her to have a miscarriage. She supported the movement. She supported Say Her Name. She talked about the Say Her Name campaign Sandra Bland, very consistently. Uh, and even during the uprising, right? I mean, she was going in. As many of us were. She was talking about the military-industrial complex. She was talking about police who taunted these high school kids towards violence. She talked about how, to quote her, when the city was on fire and they were being blamed, she's like, "We don't own none of this shit." Direct quote. And that was the person that she was, and that type of work apparently was disqualifying. And so this is what I'm talking about: the impact and the implications of these invisible weapons and recycling this power back to people who don't mean us any good. So a few things I want you to take from this. So first and foremost, I know that a lot of us engage in scholarship, and we are, for better or worse, deeply rooted in the scientific method. We read an article in class about decolonizing transnational feminism, and it talked a bit about secularizing our work, completely ignoring the sense of spirituality, right? The feeling that we get, the commitments and the beliefs that we have, and how that affects our lives and our work. So I won't sit here and tell you don't engage in the scientific method. I think it's important for data collection and analysis, sure. But there's more to our work than that. I think it's very important to acknowledge this fact of oppression. So I kind of borrowed this language from Fanon, talks about the fact of blackness, of how what we would say today, anti-Black oppression, is externally determined. Somebody looks at you and says, you know, you're Black, and therefore I'm going to do this thing to you. And how that's just a fact of life, the ontology of that, how it affects you inwardly and outwardly. And I want to talk about the fact of oppression. I'm not interested in doing or reading work that says racism is real. I think we got it right now. If we want to talk about what's changed, how these systems have updated themselves, I think that's very important. And that's the type of work I want us to be doing. It's really getting into the nuance and saying, these are the ways that they're getting us. Let's stop them. The second thing is this question of vulnerability. So when we talk about change, I think change has to be focused on uplifting vulnerable communities. So Andre and I talked earlier about what my definition of justice was. And I was telling him that there's a theory of justice that says that we need to help the majority of people. So you are kind of seated in a normal distribution, because I'm a nerd. That's how I'm going to call it. And in a normal distribution, you have the people in the center and you have people at the margin, right? And some theories say that the best thing we can do for society is help the people in the middle. We help more people and it does better work for most folks, right? And that is one way to think about it. I, being a part of Black radical or Black radical feminist traditions, would say that if you help the most vulnerable communities, helping them would help everyone, right? When the least of us are free, all of us would be free. And I think a part of that conversation requires us to do something different, right? Some people want to fix the people in positions of power, right? So if we got Kanye, Candace Owens, we took our knowledge and invested it in our communities, which, you know, we've all heard, and some of us still say, right, the kind of colonizer approach, then things will be better. And I want us to really second guess that, because the reality is, one, it assumes, as a teacher in the room would teach me, it assumes a deficit model, that the people in the communities don't already have the thing that you need. And two, when they don't want to listen to you telling them to do that, then what? That's when blame starts to happen. So, well, listen to your brilliant plans, I wrote. So instead of this paternalism, I think we need to hear people's stories. We need to find out how and when and where and why they're being taken advantage of. And then we need to work with them. Talking to people and not at them. It's a low bar, but a great start. And the last thing, I'll end where I started, with this idea of Black lives mattering. The book deals with Black politics. It also deals with Asian American politics, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latin politics, white politics, right? We go across that racial spectrum. I talk about the gender divide as well between men and women in particular. But I think it is deeply rooted in Black politics in particular, and the lessons for the Black freedom struggle. And that's something I'm very proud about contributing to that conversation. which, you know, it makes great sense that I'm in Douglas Hall. But I think that it's important to remember that the movement was never somebody's research agenda, and it shifted our lives nonetheless, right? It wasn't somebody's great book, but there was people on the ground doing work, being engaged in protest, and it got a lot of us off our asses, frankly. It sparked a movement that, in a lot of ways, we were very disconnected from as a people. So, you know, I think in closing, I would say, give them their flowers, give the movement its due acknowledgement, and give yourself a chance to just say thank you to them and to yourselves, right? We've given a lot, I think, in the name of liberation and freedom. Some a penny, others a pound, but we did it together, we did it for each other, and we're still doing it. So feel this movement, or feel this moment, remember the movement, and let's keep pushing this thing forward. Dr. Nyambi Carter.
I know you talked about it earlier, but I don't know what they did. Yeah, there's a definition, but then that term is expanding about a lot. And, you know, one of the things that we like, wow, it is opposite, right? Does the work say like, you know, that close. So that boundary, well, I don't know that's something that practical investment, but if everything is practical, then what is practical?
Love it. So I would say that I am being very specific about Black queer feminist politics, that those are a radical politics, but that this is a conversation that we need to have about directing these politics. So to your point, Q, I think he was upset with maybe Kamala Harris for not meeting with him or something. He was upset with love. Yeah, so a big part of this work for me is exactly what you're saying, that politics, it's so easy to misconstrue the conversation. It's almost impossibly hard to narrow it down. So for me, I asked myself, what hill am I willing to die on? And I'm willing to die on a hill that says, these radical politics are doing something that actually opens up our relationships with people, that builds community, and actually provides a solution that isn't hurting more people. And that conversation requires, it's some housekeeping among the radical left, even. So there is no way to tell somebody that they are wrong or that they can't be helped. But there is a way to say, hey, look, this is why what we're doing is different than what they're doing. This is how this will get us free. And this is how that continues to reinforce the same problem. So I have another book project that I'm working on, tentatively titled Anti, because I do love Rihanna. Music, don't get weird. But I mean, but that project is going to talk about anti-radicalism, how people are reinforcing Black capitalism, are reinforcing this kind of reactionary anti-feminism, this kind of contrarian individualism, and does so in a way that alienates people, but also works against our interests. And doing so in a way, and this is not, I mean, I've mentioned Kanye a couple times, but like this is Kanye, this is Kyrie Irving, this is Dave Chappelle, this is J. Cole saying I don't read, in response to No Name reading. And this is me saying, look, I can disagree with you. I can say that this is absurd and you need to get it together without saying you're less than a person. And that is one of the parts of the narrative that makes it harder, not impossible, to shout these people down when it's like, yeah, but the way that you are using this as an excuse to dehumanize folks is wrong. And so those conversations need to be had. But for me, this is the hill I choose to die on, essentially. Bad choice of words given the context, but G. Hey, Jay, my bad.
And think about my question is, who is going here and then most likely is also about why story. So for instance, to not why it was that we could have learned about it.
Yeah, so huh? Repeat the question. So the question is, who's the most likely to be targeted by these invisible weapons? So that's abridged. So two things. One, I think it's important to emphasize that there is no one Black community, but that we are many communities. And to my mind, those communities, I would differentiate or distinguish them based on their political persuasions, rather than based on their different experiences with oppression. So I think that's important. But to answer your question, this is chapter 3, I want to say. This is the survey data that talks about how in the racial and gender hierarchies, if we agree that women and Black people are at the bottom of each hierarchy, and of course, I did not have the data to get into trans and gender nonconforming community, but in the stereotypical gender hierarchy, oh, hey, he's great. He has great questions. The data basically shows that as you move down that hierarchy, you're more likely to reinforce these politics. So this is how I got to the idea that people are actually being targeted based on their experiences with marginalization. Which people are being convinced not to do this? And so what we saw was that white men were always at the top. They were always the ones who were least likely to express this disempowerment, these political contradictions. They were most likely to engage in politics that made some reasonable sense. So the case in point would be, I talked to people who believed in some sense of democratic socialism, the government should be providing jobs, and tried to figure out among those people who had some sense of efficacy, right? Who said, I believe this thing and I feel like I can try and get something done, right? White men, right at the top, right? They can do anything. And at the bottom, always Black women, right? And the gaps are just huge, right? And so it goes between white men through Black and Latino and Latina communities, right? And so Black people are at the bottom, Latinos and Latinas are in the middle, white people are at the top. Same thing with long-term unemployed people. So I surveyed people and asked, and not long-term, those were my interviews actually. But the survey, I looked at people who were earning less than $50,000 a year and tried to figure out what their hard work beliefs were, right? So you're working, and I chose not to use the poverty line because poverty line is absurd, absolutely ridiculous. I used 50K because I thought it was a reasonable, fair estimate. But I was looking at people who earned 50K and believed that hard work was the key to success, both in their lives, in the workplace, and in politics, right? People, in my mind, as I argue, that's a contradiction politically. Because then you're saying, I don't know, I'm not working hard enough, which I just don't think that's the case. And the same thing, right? So the reason why I get to this conversation with Corinne Gaines is not because I'm doing this thing that a lot of people do where they fetishize Black womanhood and treat it as if Black women, you know, to quote Combahee, we reject queenhood and pedestals, right? We want to be human and levelly human, close quote. I get there because it's very clear that the multiple marginalization, the double and triple jeopardy is something that is not just about oppressions overlapping at intersections of oppression, but it's also about how people are being targeted. And sometimes we can't necessarily see that target or the effectiveness of it, but we can see how people's politics are reflected. Does that answer your question? I think it does. There's a whole chapter on it. Other questions?
First five things, they're talking about. And when there's. Are just like, it is the fault of the community for. Just like, I mean.
Yeah. Short answer is it works when they get elected. Oh, repeat the question. Sorry. The question was, why are so many elected officials, particularly Black elected officials, embracing neoliberal politics? Particularly from readings by Lester Spence. Can't Knock the Hustle. It's one of them. Yeah. Michael Dawson and Megan Dean Francis have one too about neoliberal politics, Black neoliberal politics, the racial order for 2016. The short answer is that it works. If you engage in these politics, you get seen as a kind of middle of the road pragmatist. You get seen as somebody who is smart and thoughtful. You get seen as somebody who's not engaging in anger, that includes what we talked about, that isn't doing stuff in such a way that disqualifies you from being potentially successful. Now, you're more likely to see folks bucking that trend at the state and local levels. But I would leave that to my folks who study institutional politics. But generally, this is a part of the problem, that what are we choosing to support? What are we choosing to reinforce? Because a lot of times, who was I talking to? I think I was talking to Barbara Ramsey about this, where she was saying, yeah, but even folks who are a little bit further left, when they get into office, then we kind of abandon them in a lot of ways. We actually don't continue to reinforce their success while they're in office. Because of that, they eventually do kind of get subsumed by the system. And so I think it's a part of a larger problem with electoral politics in the US, where they have kind of figured out a way to rig the system towards, and particularly partisanship plays a big role in this, because the Democratic Party is a big tent, right? So you can sway one way or another, but if you're not a team player, you're not going to necessarily get the things you need. So there are a lot of challenges there, and I get that, but we're not yet at the place where far left candidates are being promoted to mass, like critical mass, to actually be able to have it. Great question. Hey. Is there a way to give reparations without a sense of sympathy or belittling attached to that? So kind of like a victim, help the poor people kind of sense. I don't know. This is a really good question. I don't know. I never really think about how other people are going to feel about redistribution, because I assume that in any redistributive context, it's going to receive a backlash. Is your concern about the way that other people are going to view it, or that people might reject it because they don't want to feel like a victim, or neither of those? Someone like white guilt. Yeah. So the question is more so, and this is for the Zoom. The question is more about, are there contexts where people aren't having either a savior complex or a sense of white guilt, but that they're giving reparations or considering that because it is owed, it's due. I think that these types of fights need to be had on multiple fronts. If I can white guilt America into reparations, I will do that. I don't care how they feel. Truly, like, you have too much, please give it. But I do think, to your point, it is important to understand that if we want to create a sustainable relationship moving forward, that it is important to be able to see each other as levelly human, as I mentioned before from COVID. And so Also, this is a big hypothetical because we just don't see a lot of redistribution, particularly in this country. But you're getting into questions about white politics, and honestly, I don't know about their emotional maturity with respect to sharing of resources. It's a challenge, but I think that's something that sounds truly like people usually say this when they can't answer questions, and maybe I can't, but like that sounds like something you should research if you're really curious about that, because I actually think it's fascinating. Oh, hand over here. Hey, Jermaine. I'm sorry, Dr. Gavin. Mm. The question is, in what democratic framework could I see, as I said in the concluding slides, could I see this actually working? Because I do have a normative thrust to my work in the sense of saying that I do take a position and think this is happening explicitly. I think my response would be that a lot of times when we have these conversations about change and justice, we think broad brush strokes. We think broad, systemic, completely changing everything. What I have found in the communities that I've worked with is that you can create change in the community that you belong to specifically, narrowly. So the easiest and potentially dissatisfying way to explain that is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And so in that book, she describes literally everything that we're dealing with right now in terms of climate disaster, in terms of Trump, in terms of just chaos. And she writes in the preface that this book is about thousands of years, bless you, about thousands of years in the future. And there's some religion that saved the world. And there's these myths about where it started, how it began. I don't think she called it religion, some like belief system that changed the world. And there's myths about where it started and how it began. And I want to tell that story. But the story wasn't some great, divine being. There was just a Black girl named Lauren Olamina, who wanted to do right by her community and just did what made sense to her. Right. And in my mind, that's where these politics, that's where I've learned them from. That's what I've learned about them. And that's where they can be effective and can grow from there, is that the capacity to actually create community is what's required to get the accountability that we need, to get the empathy that we need, to get the vulnerability that I believe is at the root of any community that believes it can thrive and succeed. If that community, be it democratic or not, is a question. But I think it's one of those things where I think there's a lot of examples. You can talk about teacher-student relationships. You can talk about colleagues. You can talk about friendships, family, right? There's a lot of different ways to talk about it. But to my mind, these are the politics that work in that local scale and can be built out to a broader global scale. It's just for the process. So I think it has happened. It is happening. But the hierarchy of power that we acknowledge does not necessarily recognize that. So, Curtis, what's up, bro? Come on, Black people. Question is, what does it look like? What is a win for 12% of the population. So, you knew me in college. I was a wild boy. And back then, my thought about change was that broad stroke. And I was convinced that the only way we win is with a violent overthrow of the government in the world. All right, big Haitian revolution energy. All right. What I've learned since then, particularly as I was introduced to and welcomed into and embraced by radical Black feminism and politics, is that the thing that we all were doing the entire time, those of us, the people who just in my life, the thing we were doing the whole time is the thing that could actually save the world. 1%, 2%, 12%. That our capacity to create community with one another in a way where we understand one another, where we share with one another, where we care about one another, we support one another. What else are we looking for in a world besides a space where we can have what we need and be uplifted by who we have? And so for me, I don't like to think anymore about our shared oppression as something that connects us. I don't think that actually makes us the same. To Dr. Carter's point, we have plenty of people who share that oppression and they think that the way to deal with that is fundamentally different. I think that one of the easier ways to explain it is Marxists, right? They're radicals. They have a narrow class analysis. And then Black Marxists showed up and were like, hey, class and race are inseparable. You need to do better. Now, there are still Marxists who are not Black Marxists because they just refuse. They're like, no, we don't want to do that. And to that, I'd say, let them go. Right? You can't take everybody with you. And so I think identifying, and this is something that Michael Dawson talks about in Black Vision, which is another project that I'm doing, an update to that talks about Black political ideologies. He wrote it in 2000, before 9/11, before Katrina, before Obama, before Trump, before COVID. Jesus. But we can, in Black Visions, Dawson talked about what makes Black political ideology special. They talk about who and what is the enemy. They talk about, should we engage in separatism? They talk about, what do you think about white people? Where do they fit into these conversations? What do you think about the American dream, right? And the answers to these questions vary across the board, but being able to find, back to the answer that I gave Dr. Carter, being able to find your people, right? And this goes back to what Ella Baker would say, like, who are you people? Who are you with? Where are you coming from, right? Where are you going? Being able to identify those people who you align with and create a pathway to the restorative justice context, create a pathway for people to be able to join that process, right? That's process, right? I think a lot of times we talk about change, we talk about justice, we talk about the future in terms of a light switch, and it's not that, right? It's the current, it's the electricity, it's the process that goes into these switches. We got to keep making them. And without thinking about it that way, without thinking about it in that narrow sense, I think we miss something about what we're doing in life, what we're doing in learning and love and in this world. Three people over here. Do I think three people in the corner of the room could run the room? Do I think that they can? I don't understand the question. I see. Can a few people control the minute? Yeah. If we all agree for them to be our leaders, sure. Oh, sure. Yeah. The American with Disability Act. You know when the sidewalk go down? Yeah.
it's not perfect, but I think there are moments in
Yeah.
that things that are not important.
Oh, okay, I got you. So the question,
We all been in different work.
yeah, how do we win? Yeah. And I think that the question is, how do we win? And some of the answers are, one, we've seen with the Americans with Disabilities Act, that there is a way for people with disabilities to implement changes that impact and benefit everyone. And there's another example that in the world, this people can't hear. There's an example that in the world, white people are a global minority, and yet white Americans in particular have instituted a system of domination that is global imperialism. But the question is, how do we win? And I think the answer is that I've already answered it, but you don't like it, and that's okay. And that's okay, because I think the win that you're describing or looking for me, has more to do with control, has more to do with reinstituting a certain type of domination, and I'm not interested in a world that looks like that. So I want a world that looks like our relationship. You don't dominate me, I don't dominate you, right? We like each other. Oh my God, he brought up basketball and he is lying. You are lying. But like, I think that there's, and this gets back to the impact of feminism, Black feminism in particular, is that it's not some cliche you get to throw out and get a I'm a feminist tattoo in the middle of your forehead, right? There's actually a way of there's an epistemology, there's a way of living that's involved with some versions, right? There are carceral feminists, I ain't with them. There are cultural feminists that want to just flip the hierarchy from top to bottom, I'm not with them, right? But there is a particular strand of feminism through Bell Hooks, through Joy James, through Beth Ritchie, that talk about what freedom can be and what the world can look like. These are the people who are violence interrupters in communities in Chicago, right? They go out and they say, we want people to know each other and to be able to de-escalate when they have conflict. We want people to not be villainized, right? So we were talking about Takeoff earlier, or I mentioned at least, right? There are people talking about, well, you live that gangster life, that's what you're gonna get, right? I don't want that. I don't want that for us. I want us to be able to acknowledge that, sure, I don't know the circumstances of this man's death, but I recognize that there's pain there. I recognize that there's hurt and there's trauma, and I want to turn that down. So that's the kind of world I want to live. I don't want to live in a world where we're constantly standing on top of each other to try and climb to a higher rank. I want to live in a world where we can care about one another in a way that actually has substantive impact, that actually takes us somewhere from point A to point B and moves us in a way that is as causes as little trauma as possible. I want us to have joy. And I think, as someone who's known me for a while, I think I've always had that, but I didn't always know how important it was. And now I do. And I hope maybe one day you do too, because as you know, you happy as hell. You find it, I'll go. Straight up, no bullshit. Mom, get off the call. Jeez. Other questions? I don't know what we're doing on time. 2 minutes? You want me to read them?
Say it again.
Gino. Gino asks, how have you found Howard University complicit in both the proliferation and removal of these invisible weapons? Gino, I just got here, bro. So I am new to Howard. And I am getting to know how things work here. So I would say that one thing that I think is great about Howard is that there seems to be some sense of direct democracy involved here. That people know that if you want something done, you can go reach out to somebody who has some power, talk to them, and get it done. So from what I'm understanding, if we're talking about process, from what I'm understanding, this question about invisible weapons isn't, I'm sure it exists everywhere, but I would have to get to know more people in this community to actually be able to figure that out. And I'm teaching online right now. So honestly, I don't know. I'll be tapping in with the students. Gino was a former student at Georgetown. As far as the faculty is concerned, we've been great, to be completely honest. People have been open, they've been supportive, they've been kind and caring. You probably couldn't see, but there was a whole bunch of folks in here today just kind of showing love and to me. Now, what it's like to be a junior faculty here, I don't know. I can't speak to that yet. What it's like to be an adjunct here, I don't know. I'm glad they have a union. That's the most I can say about that. Brody Cook asked, should we give up on companies and institutions? They're only as open to change as a few or the least of those within them. That worth the fight when even the majority of the few people of color are fearful of radical politics. I think that's a great question. I would say, I think that's all the questions, right? I would say it depends on what you mean by giving up on institutions. I don't trust these people. I don't rely on them for my well-being. They're not the source of who I am and how I establish myself in this world. So I keep a healthy skepticism of all institutions, and will continue to do that, institutions and companies. I will continue to do the work that I do, not because so few people actually agree with it, but because they might. That process is an ongoing thing. And in the same way that I came to my politics and I came to my capacity, today, I'm continuing to grow. And I also recognize that other people are continuing to grow too. And if I can just create a lane, all right, I have some friends who still engage in all sorts of problematic beliefs and values, but I've gotten them so far to at least be able to say, I know what you're gonna say when when they say some nonsense. And I'm like, you're right, but I'm gonna say it anyway. And I think that's part of the process sometimes. You have to decide who you're willing to work with and who you're not willing to work with. You establish your boundaries and you do what you can when you can. And when you can't, you don't. It's as simple as that for me. I feel like, what time is it? I think we're done. We had a good run. Appreciate y'all. If you need a book, come holler at me. I got a couple. Thanks.